So we're coming towards the end of class, and so we've got one more lesson to go. And for this lesson on increasing organizational performance, I'm going to just hit a few highlights during this lesson, but most of this is going to be a read and reflect lesson. So the third page notes for this chapter is quite extensive because most of what we're going to be looking at are different techniques you can use to try to evaluate programmatic effectiveness. Now, the important thing to think about with this is obviously this is much higher level advanced clinician sort of things as far as administration, things that you probably would not be associated with early on in your career, but tools for later on. And so because of that, I want you to also think about this from the standpoint of how you can use the strategies that we're talking about from programmatic effectiveness for some of your own personal effectiveness as well. Combine these with what we saw before in improving personal effectiveness. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we talk about organizational effectiveness and all of these sorts of things, really what we're looking at is trying to address this organizational gap. We have where we are now, and we need to evaluate that for different causes and influences and what's creating this situation. But then we need to also dream about where we want to be. And so organizational effectiveness is about this change. When we talk about strategic planning opposed to long-term planning, we're talking about bridging this gap, trying to move from where we are now to where we want to be, opposed to just planning for continuing where we currently are. And so when we look at the strategic planning process, it is just one of the wheels associated within the overall framework for our organization. We have the strategic planning process, obviously continuous improvement, and then the evaluation, the feedback loop of that. But notice it all centers on our mission, values, and goals. If we don't have a strong understanding of what our mission, values, and goals are for our organization, we don't have that next step in our minds of where we want to be. And so this is where the first process needs to occur. Where do you want to be as an organization? Where do you want to be as a clinician? And so once you have that, now you can start thinking about how are we going to get there, right? How are we going to then get there through continuous improvement by using the plans identified in the strategic planning, and then how are we going to evaluate if we are in fact making that there. So think about strategic planning as basically taking all of the different things that we have that we work with and put them into a conscious thought process. That's really what strategic planning is taking all of these inputs, all of the different things that we've created and or need to create and think about, and bring them all together in one cohesive plan that will drive how we are going to get to where we want to be. And then from that, all of these come into some form of this PDCA, or plan, do, check, act cycle. All right? So there are a bunch of different techniques that are introduced in your text. Make sure you read those, understand what they are, be able to identify those based on their name and what they do. But understand that they all come into some form of this cycle with we're going to plan what needs to happen. We need to do it, check to see that it is in fact done and is reaching the goal, and then if need be, act on that to make changes into the current plan, right? And so it is this constant loop associated with trying to make sure we are constantly moving towards our long-term goals. And so some of the main ones here, right, that you go through: needs assessment, feasibility studies, process evaluation, outcome evaluation, cost analyses. These are all different tools as part of the planning process with different components associated with them. So focus particularly on these program evaluation techniques as well while you go through your readings. The last couple of things I want to introduce are some specific components that need to work their way into your strategic plan. And the first is systems-based thinking, or just systems thinking. And the idea with systems thinking is that when we break things apart, right, and evaluate them in isolation, we lose a larger component of what these things do together. And so you need to think about how all of the different components of your organization interact to form a larger group dynamic. And so some examples with that are, the reinforcing or balancing loops. And each one of those have their own thing, but based on how one thing occurs, does that lead to more of that occurring, or does that lead to somewhat of the opposite? And so spend some time thinking about and understanding what this systems-based thinking is, understanding that there is much more than breaking this down into its individual components, which is probably one of the biggest errors in strategic planning. And then is the learning organization, right? This has been a key thing in the last few years, couple decades now, with this idea of making sure that the organization is built around principles that allows the organization as a whole to continue to grow with that. And they talk about the 5 principles of a learning organization, but the first one here is personal mastery, right? You have to encourage each individual to continue to learn and grow themselves in order to then bring that to the table for the entire organization to grow. So understand also this idea of the learning organization and some of these learning disabilities that come into play. And the biggest one is I am my position, the idea that you just focus on your job and there's little sense of responsibility for the overall group. If I had any advice to take from this for you personally and professionally, it would be to understand that if you only do your job, then you will only be seen as able to do that job. You need, especially early on in your career, to look for opportunities to continue to grow, to continue to develop, to continue to serve your organizations in new and innovative ways. In the same way as a student, you were very interested in seeing what other people were doing so you could learn those skills. Continue that on in your professional careers. Learn what administrators are doing. Learn what other clinicians are doing, right? Continue to grow as an individual so that way you can continue to get better. If all you do is treat your athletes and treat your patients, you will just get the same experience over and over, and you will not get new experiences that you will need to increase your success long term. Lastly, just to throw in there this idea of strategic and structurally related problems with that. Take a look at some of these different things with that. This is much more administrative use, but I wanted to put it in there so you focused on it as well. What all of these sorts of things are, why they can become problematic. There are good descriptions within your text for that. And so that really does bring us to the end of our journey here as far as these lessons. You still have your semester project, so that's what you should be focusing on now for the next few weeks as far as class time and time in between, and then your final exam. The final exam is going to be all multiple choice and true-false questions largely from the textbook. So go back, make sure you're reading the text, looking at those sorts of things. Study as if this was a non-athletic training class is my best advice. Right? Normally in athletic training classes, we really focus on large, big picture sort of things, and administration is just not that aspect. We're just not there yet. We need to start very fundamental. So even though this is a 600 level class, it's because of the content. We're still approaching it much more like a 100 level class where you need to learn the very basics. This is your first course in administration. And so you need to understand a lot of definitions, a lot of different concepts. Make sure you go back into the text, look at your third page notes, study for that, and you'll be successful. All right. And again, if you have any questions or need anything,